Imagine this: dawn spilling across the Giza plateau and the pyramids emerging from the sand like frozen constellations. Traveller, you weren't led here by accident. Something in the universe has quietly arranged this moment, placing you before a geometry that refuses to feel ancient. What if the pyramids are not the beginning of civilization, but the last surviving memory of one that endured the younger Dryas? Around 12,900 years ago, Earth's climate shifted with startling speed, turning familiar landscapes into silence within generations. And yet these angles remain aligned with the sky as if waiting to be read. Listen. As stone becomes evidence, and the desert becomes an archive, let's drift a little deeper. The Giza Plateau concentrates a rare conjunction of human ambition and astronomical attention. The pyramids are immense, even by modern standards, yet their most enduring provocation is not their mass but their placement. From above, the three main pyramids, those traditionally attributed to Khufu Khafra and Menkaure, do not form a perfectly regular arrangement. The line between the two larger pyramids is not cleanly extended by the third. Menkaure's pyramid sits slightly offset from the axis, a subtle misalignment that looks at first glance like the kind of irregularity created by terrain constraints or administrative compromise. That offset has become one of the most argued over details in archaeoastronomy. In the early 1990s, engineer and independent researcher Robert Bauval proposed that the asymmetry is not a mistake, but a deliberate echo of the sky. He suggested that the ground plan of the pyramids corresponds to the pattern of Orion's belt Alnitak, Alnilam and Mintaka, whose three stars form a line that is also imperfect with one star slightly displaced. The claim is straightforward. The pyramids present a terrestrial snapshot of a celestial configuration not in vague symbolism but in measurable geometry. If the correspondence is real, it implies that the Giza layout was guided by a specific astronomical template, rather than by purely dynastic or practical considerations. The appeal of this idea is obvious. Ancient Egyptians watched the sky closely. Their calendar depended on celestial cycles. Their agriculture depended on the Nile. Their religious imagination connected kingship with stars and eternal return. Orion in particular held mythological weight through its association with Osiris in later periods, and Sirius linked to Isis carried practical importance because its heliacal rising related to the timing of the inundation. Against that backdrop, an argument that architecture and sky were intentionally fused is not inherently unreasonable. Bauval's proposal, however, rests on more than the basic idea of sky-linked monuments. It emphasizes specificity, not merely that the pyramids align with Orion in some symbolic sense, but that their spacing and offset mirror the belt's pattern. Advocates go further, arguing that relative brightness has a loose parallel in pyramid size, with the largest pyramid corresponding to the brightest belt star. Critics respond that such reasoning risks subjectivity. With 3 points on the ground and 3 points in the sky, some similarity is statistically likely, and the temptation to treat a visually pleasing match as proof can override caution. The question then is not whether patterns exist. Humans are exceptionally good at finding them, but whether the pattern is constrained enough to be meaningful. That is why the argument often turns from geometry to time. Orion's belt is visible today, but the sky is not static across millennia. Earth's axis undergoes axial precession, a slow wobble that changes the apparent positions of stars relative to the horizon over long intervals. If a monument was designed to reflect a particular sky configuration, then the fit between ground and sky should become more or less accurate depending on the date chosen. Bauval used astronomical simulations to rewind the sky and asked when the correlation would have been most exact. The striking claim is that the best match occurs not around the conventional Old Kingdom chronology, roughly the 3rd millennium BCE, but around 10,500 BCE. This is where a technical discussion becomes a historical provocation. A date near 10,500 BCE sits close to the end of the last glacial period and within the broad time window often associated with dramatic climatic transitions, including the younger Dryas and the subsequent warming into the Holocene. It's also the era frequently invoked in debates about the Great Sphinx's enclosure erosion, which some geologists have argued is more consistent with sustained rainfall than with the hyper-arid conditions that dominated later in dynastic times. In that framing, Giza becomes not simply a masterpiece of Old Kingdom engineering, but a site whose deepest story might begin far earlier, in a world where North Africa's climate and hydrology were markedly different. From a strictly scientific standpoint, the leap from an astronomical date to an archaeological redating is not automatic. Astronomical simulations can propose when a geometric match would be optimal, but they cannot by themselves prove that an ancient builder intended that match. A correlation can be generated by selecting the date that improves the fit. A fit can be improved by choosing which features count as relevant, and the sky can be made to agree with almost any hypothesis if the interpretive flexibility is high enough. These are well-known hazards in archaeoastronomy, a field that must constantly defend itself against pattern overreach. Yet the Orion debate persists because Giza is full of measurements that do not feel casual. The pyramids are oriented with notable accuracy toward the cardinal directions, and the Great Pyramid's near-north alignment in particular has been measured as remarkably precise. Conventional explanations propose stellar methods, observing circumpolar stars and using their transits to establish true north. Such a method does not require telescopes or compasses, only disciplined observation and reliable sightlines. It implies, however, a sustained tradition of skywatching and the ability to translate celestial motion into architectural reference frames with repeatable accuracy. Even in the most conservative view, the builders possessed an operational astronomy advanced enough to guide monumental construction. This is why some scholars and engineers view Giza less as a set of isolated projects and more as the visible end of a longer intellectual inheritance. High precision rarely emerges abruptly. It typically depends on accumulated practice, standardized techniques, and institutional memory knowledge transmitted and refined across generations. If that continuity existed, it could explain how the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom achieved their alignments without requiring a lost high-tech civilization. At the same time, it keeps open the more unsettling possibility that the monuments are not only products of their era, but also carriers of earlier insights whose origins have become obscure. The most intriguing version of the Orion hypothesis is not the claim that the pyramids were built in 10500 BCE. It is the subtler idea that the builders may have been encoding a reference to that epoch, as if marking a chronological waypoint rather than recording a construction date. In that model, the pyramids become a kind of time capsule. Human languages fracture, calendars are rewritten, political timelines collapse. But the sky's slow movements are predictable. A monument that embeds a celestial timestamp could in principle communicate across deep time to any later culture capable of reconstructing ancient skies. It would not say who built it in words. It would say when a certain remembered sky mattered. Whether one accepts that interpretation or rejects it, the debate forces a fundamental historical question. What kind of society builds monuments that remain legible in the language of the heavens? The pyramids are often treated as the endpoint of royal ideology. Tombs, symbols of state power, monuments to divine kingship. The Orion argument shifts the emphasis toward a different motive, a desire to bind human history to cosmic cycles, to place a civilization's memory under the custody of stars. That motive fits both religious imagination and scientific instinct. It also explains why the puzzle endures. Giza is not only a technical achievement, it is an invitation to test how far evidence can take us, and to admit without embarrassment where evidence stops. The result is a paradox that sits at the heart of the plateau. The stones offer measurements, alignments, and patterns that encourage analysis, yet they refuse to provide a definitive narrative. Certainty is easy to claim and hard to justify. The most responsible position is neither dismissal nor credulity, but a disciplined openness, an insistence on measurable constraints, an awareness of statistical pitfalls, and a recognition that some monuments survive precisely because they were built to outlast explanation. If the astronomical argument raises questions of intention and chronology, the geological evidence surrounding the Giza Plateau introduces questions of environment and survival. Stone does not record myths or dynasties, but it does preserve interaction with climate. Weathering patterns, sediment layers, and erosion geometries form a slow archive of physical conditions. In this sense, the landscape itself becomes a document, one that can be read independently of inscriptions or king lists. At Giza, that document complicates the conventional historical narrative. The most controversial geological feature is the Sphinx enclosure. Unlike the pyramids, which were constructed from quarried blocks, the Sphinx's body and surrounding trench were carved directly from bedrock. This distinction matters because bedrock retains erosion signatures far more reliably than dressed stone. Several geologists have noted that the walls of the Sphinx enclosure exhibit rounded profiles and vertical channels that resemble rainfall erosion rather than wind abrasion. Wind-driven sand typically produces sharp edges, undercut ledges and horizontal striations. Sustained rainfall, by contrast, generates smoother contours and downward flowing channels. The difficulty is not identifying erosion but dating it. Egypt's climate has been arid for thousands of years, particularly since the mid-Holocene. During the Old Kingdom, when mainstream chronology places the Sphinx around 2500 BCE, annual rainfall in the Giza region would have been minimal. Heavy persistent rain, sufficient to carve the enclosure walls as observed, would require climatic conditions radically different from those known in dynastic times. This discrepancy is what led some researchers to argue that the Sphinx's core must be significantly older than its accepted date. Critics counter that erosion can occur through multiple processes. Subsurface water salt crystallization, temperature cycling, and localized runoff could all contribute to weathering without invoking a pluvial climate. They also note that restoration and quarrying activity around the Sphinx complicate the visual record. Blocks removed from the enclosure were used to build nearby temples, exposing some surfaces while shielding others. Over thousands of years, this uneven exposure could exaggerate certain patterns. The debate, therefore, is not between science and myth, but between competing geological interpretations applied to an unusually complex site. What strengthens the climate-based argument is that it does not rely on Giza alone. Across North Africa, independent lines of evidence indicate that the Sahara experienced a markedly wetter phase between roughly 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. This period, often referred to as the African humid period, transformed what's now desert into a mosaic of lakes, rivers and grasslands. Pollen cores extracted from ancient lake beds reveal grasses and shrubs inconsistent with aridity. Fossil remains of aquatic animals, including fish and crocodiles, appear in regions that are now inhospitable. Rock art across the central Sahara depicts cattle hunters and boats scenes impossible under modern desert conditions. Satellite radar surveys have added another layer of confirmation by revealing buried river systems beneath the sand. One of the largest, the Tamanrasset Paleo-River, once drained much of northwest Africa and flowed toward the Atlantic. Other paleo channels ran eastward, feeding tributaries that ultimately connected with the Nile system. These were not ephemeral streams, but large-scale hydrological networks that persisted for millennia. Their existence establishes that heavy rainfall was not a marginal phenomenon, but a defining feature of the region's prehistoric environment. Within this context, the idea that monumental construction could predate the dynastic period becomes less implausible, at least environmentally. A wetter climate would have supported larger populations, broader resource bases, and greater mobility across what is now barren terrain. It would also have made stoneworking less constrained by water scarcity. None of this proves the existence of a lost high civilization, but it challenges the assumption that complex behavior must emerge only under conditions familiar to later historical societies. The Younger Dryas adds a further complication. This abrupt climatic reversal, beginning around 12,900 years ago, temporarily interrupted the planet's transition out of the last ice age. Temperatures dropped sharply in the North Atlantic region, and climate systems across the globe destabilized. In North Africa, the effects appear to have included shifts in monsoon patterns and periods of aridity punctuated by return pulses of moisture. For human populations, such instability would have been disruptive. Landscapes that had supported life for generations could deteriorate rapidly, forcing migration and cultural reorganization. From a historical perspective, abrupt climate change tends to erase evidence rather than preserve it. Settlements built of organic materials decay. Infrastructure tied to riverbanks vanishes when rivers shift or dry. What survives are structures anchored into bedrock or elevated above floodplains, precisely the kinds of constructions that characterize Giza. This does not require intentional preservation. It is a statistical outcome of erosion and survival. The desert does not favour continuity of life, but it excels at preserving stone. This raises an interpretive possibility that avoids the extremes of both orthodoxy and speculation. The monuments at Giza may represent palimpsest structures built, modified, restored and reinterpreted across long spans of time. In this view, Old Kingdom Egyptians did not necessarily originate everything they worked with. They may have inherited a landscape already marked by monumental forms or sacred geography, which they then adapted to their own religious and political frameworks. Such reuse is well documented elsewhere in the ancient world, where later cultures built atop earlier foundations without fully understanding their origins. Textual hints, though fragmentary and debated, fit uneasily into this picture. Later Egyptian inscriptions sometimes describe monuments as already ancient, already buried, already damaged when rediscovered. Mythological language blurs historical memory, but it often preserves kernels of environmental reality: floods, droughts, cycles of destruction and renewal. While such texts cannot be treated as literal records, they reflect a cultural awareness that time extends beyond dynastic continuity. The resistance to extending Giza's timeline is understandable. Archaeology depends on stratigraphy, datable materials, and contextual coherence. Stone alone is difficult to date precisely without associated organic remains. Radiocarbon methods do not apply cleanly to limestone. As a result, mainstream chronology relies heavily on inscriptions, tool styles, and cultural sequences that cluster the pyramids firmly within the Old Kingdom. Any challenge to that framework must contend with a vast body of evidence, not dismiss it. Yet scientific caution cuts both ways. When geological data and climatic reconstructions suggest conditions incompatible with accepted timelines, the responsible response is not automatic rejection, but careful reassessment. History is not a closed system. It is revised when new tools, new measurements, or new perspectives reveal inconsistencies. The past century has already pushed human history far deeper than once imagined, extending symbolic behaviour art and complex social organisation tens of thousands of years beyond earlier estimates. What ultimately emerges from the Giza debate is not a single alternative history, but a methodological tension. How much weight should be given to environmental evidence relative to textual tradition? How should symbolic alignment be evaluated against statistical coincidence? And how willing should scholarship be to tolerate ambiguity when monuments clearly exceed the explanatory power of simple models? The pyramids and the Sphinx endure because they sit at the intersection of these questions. They are neither mute stones nor transparent texts. They are constraints forcing inquiry to slow down, to measure carefully, and to accept that some structures were built with temporal horizons far longer than those of the societies that later claimed them. Whether they mark the culmination of Old Kingdom genius, the inheritance of deeper traditions, or a combination of both, they remain evidence that human history is not a straight ascent, but a layered terrain shaped by climate, memory, and survival. If the monuments of Giza preserve anything beyond stone and geometry, it is the idea that human history unfolds in cycles rather than lines. Civilizations emerge within particular environmental windows, flourish under stable conditions, and fracture when those conditions collapse. Climate data from ice cores, marine sediments, and terrestrial records now show that such collapses can occur with startling speed. Societies built around predictable seasons can find themselves displaced within a few generations. When this happens, continuity is broken not because knowledge disappears instantly, but because the systems that sustain it do. In this light, the possibility that the builders of Giza were heirs to earlier traditions no longer sounds implausible or sensational. It sounds consistent with how knowledge behaves under stress. Skills tied to stone orientation and ritual space are among the most durable forms of cultural memory. They do not depend on writing or centralized administration. They can survive migration, fragmentation, and reorganization. A displaced population may lose its cities but retain its cosmology, carrying it forward, until conditions allow monumental expression again. The Nile corridor offers a plausible mechanism for such transmission. During periods of climatic instability, it functioned as a refuge, concentrating populations along a reliable water source. Archaeological evidence shows increasing settlement density along the Nile after the Sahara's desiccation. Over time, this concentration produced social stratification, labour organisation, and ideological systems capable of supporting large-scale construction. What is often described as a sudden rise of Egyptian civilization may therefore represent not a beginning, but a convergence, the visible crystallization of ideas, practices, and memories accumulated over much longer spans. This perspective reframes the question of Giza's purpose. Instead of asking whether the pyramids were tombs or observatories, it asks why permanence mattered so deeply. The effort invested in cardinal alignment scale and material choice suggests an obsession with durability. Limestone cores fuse to bedrock massive blocks beyond easy removal, and placements away from floodplains all point toward a desire to resist erasure. Such priorities make sense in a culture that had experienced loss whether through climate shifts, migrations, or the collapse of earlier worlds. Seen this way, the pyramids become statements about time rather than power. They assert that something must remain when conditions change. They anchor meaning in stone when landscapes transform and social orders dissolve. The alignment with the sky, whether symbolic or precise, reinforces this message. Stars outlast dynasties. Their motions are slow, predictable, and indifferent to human upheaval. To link architecture to the heavens is to link memory to a clock that does not reset with each political collapse. This interpretation does not require a technologically advanced lost civilization or a forgotten global empire. It requires only that human groups living before the dynastic period possessed observational sophistication, ritual motivation, and a long memory of environmental instability. Recent discoveries at sites such as Göbekli Tepe have already demonstrated that monumental construction and symbolic complexity can arise among societies previously classified as pre-civilized. These findings weaken the assumption that agriculture, writing, or kingship are prerequisites for large-scale architecture. What remains unresolved is the boundary between inheritance and innovation. The Old Kingdom Egyptians undoubtedly transformed whatever they received. They refined construction methods, standardized proportions, and integrated monuments into a coherent ideological system centered on kingship and the afterlife. In doing so, they may have overwritten earlier meanings while preserving underlying structures. This process is not unusual in history. Later cultures routinely reinterpret ancient sites, projecting contemporary beliefs onto inherited forms. The resistance to this layered model often stems from a desire for clean timelines. Linear histories are easier to teach and easier to defend. Cyclical histories shaped by environmental disruption and cultural memory are harder to map and harder to prove. Yet the growing body of paleoclimate research makes it increasingly difficult to ignore the role of abrupt change in shaping human trajectories. Stability is the exception, not the rule. Ultimately, Giza endures not because it answers questions, but because it exposes the limits of our categories. It sits at the fault line between geology and history astronomy, and archaeology, myth and measurement. Any explanation that confines it to a single function or moment feels incomplete. The plateau suggests that human beings have long understood something modern. Societies are only beginning to rediscover that survival depends not only on innovation, but on remembering what was learned before the world changed. The persistence of Giza as a historical problem reflects a deeper tension within modern interpretations of the past. Archaeology, by necessity, favours continuity that can be documented, stratified layers, datable artefacts, inscriptions tied to named rulers. Yet the most disruptive forces shaping human history, climate shifts, ecological collapse, rapid migration, rarely leave neat material signatures. They fragment evidence rather than preserve it. When monuments like the pyramids survive such disruption, they become outliers in the record, resistant to simple classification, and prone to being forced into the nearest stable narrative. The conventional model places the pyramids squarely within the political and religious framework of the Old Kingdom, interpreting them as expressions of centralized authority, surplus labor, and royal ideology. In this view, the pyramids are the culmination of a developmental sequence. Mastabas evolve into stepped pyramids, which then give rise to true pyramids. The model is internally coherent and supported by tool marks, quarry logistics, and inscriptions found elsewhere in Egypt. Yet coherence does not guarantee completeness. It explains how the pyramids could have been built in the 3rd millennium BCE, but it does not fully address why, Such an extreme commitment to permanence and alignment emerged so early and so suddenly. One of the most revealing features of Giza is not what it contains, but what it lacks. Unlike later monumental complexes, the pyramids are largely free of narrative decoration. There are no reliefs depicting conquest, no detailed inscriptions proclaiming achievements, no overt storytelling carved into their surfaces. This silence is often attributed to funerary taboo or theological restraint. But it also invites another interpretation, that the message of the pyramids was not meant to be read in symbols or words, but in form, orientation, and endurance. Their language is mathematical and astronomical, not textual. Such a language travels differently through time. Texts depend on literacy and cultural continuity. Forms do not. A cardinal alignment remains intelligible as long as north can be found. A stellar correlation remains testable as long as the sky can be modelled. In this sense, the pyramids behave less like historical documents and more like instruments. They are passive but precise, awaiting future observers capable of asking the right questions. This characteristic alone distinguishes them from most ancient architecture. The emphasis on bedrock integration further reinforces this point. The Great Pyramid is not simply placed on the plateau, it is locked into it. Its foundation is levelled to remarkable precision, and its mass is distributed in a way that minimizes long-term deformation. The Sphinx, carved directly from living limestone, is inseparable from its geological context. These choices suggest an awareness of deep time, even if not articulated as such. Builders concerned only with immediate ritual use or dynastic display would have had little incentive to engineer structures to survive tens of millennia of environmental stress. Climate science now provides a framework for understanding why such awareness might have existed. The late Pleistocene and early Holocene were periods of pronounced instability. Rapid warming events, abrupt cooling phases like the younger Dryas, shifting monsoon systems and rising sea levels reshaped ecosystems across the globe. Human groups living through these transitions would have experienced the loss of familiar landscapes within a few lifetimes. Oral memory alone would struggle to carry the lessons of such upheaval forward. Monumentalization, fixing memory into the land itself, becomes a rational cultural response under these conditions. From this perspective, the pyramids can be understood as anchors. They do not merely honor individuals, they stabilize meaning in an unstable world. Their scale resists forgetting. Their orientation resists reinterpretation. Even when later cultures impose new stories onto them, the underlying geometry remains intact. This may explain why subsequent Egyptian dynasties, despite possessing the organizational capacity to build large monuments, never replicated the same architectural logic at the same scale. The impulse that produced Giza may have been tied to a specific historical memory that later generations inherited but did not originate. The discomfort surrounding such interpretations often stems from a fear of diminishing the achievements of known historical cultures. Yet acknowledging inheritance does not negate innovation. On the contrary, it situates innovation within a longer continuum of human experience. The Old Kingdom Egyptians did not merely copy what came before, they refined it, formalized it, and integrated it into a durable state ideology. They transformed inherited knowledge into a stable civilizational system. That achievement remains extraordinary regardless of whether its roots extend deeper than traditionally assumed. What Giza ultimately reveals is the inadequacy of strict either-or thinking. The monuments do not need to be either Old Kingdom creations or remnants of a lost civilization. They can be both products of a known culture and vessels of older memory. History, especially at deep timescales, rarely respects clean boundaries. It accumulates, compresses, and reuses. Stones are cut, recut, and reinterpreted. Landscapes are occupied, abandoned, and reclaimed. Meaning persists unevenly, carried forward by what survives. The growing convergence of archaeology, geology, and climate science makes such layered interpretations increasingly necessary. Paleoclimate data shows that the environmental backdrop of early human history was far more volatile than once believed. Archaeological discoveries continue to push symbolic and architectural behavior deeper into prehistory. In this context, monuments like the pyramids appear less anomalous and more symptomatic of a long human struggle with impermanence. Giza remains unresolved because it occupies a threshold. It stands between eras, between climates, between ways of understanding time. Its stones do not insist on a single story. They insist on durability. They compel each generation to confront the possibility that civilization has risen, fallen, and reconfigured itself more than once, leaving behind fragments that resist easy placement. In the end, the enduring power of the pyramids lies not in what they conclusively prove, but in what they force us to reconsider. They suggest that history may be deeper, more discontinuous, and more environmentally driven than traditional narratives allow. They remind us that human knowledge is fragile but not ephemeral. It can be broken, displaced, and still endure in altered form. And they stand as evidence that long before modern science named climate cycles, or modelled stellar motion human beings, were already responding to those forces, measuring them, remembering them, and carving their responses into the most permanent medium they could find. The final challenge posed by Giza is not technical, but philosophical. Once the measurements are taken, the alignments modelled, the climate reconstructed, and the erosion debated, a deeper question remains. How should modern societies interpret monuments that appear to have been built with temporal horizons far longer than our own? The pyramids confront contemporary historical thinking with an uncomfortable mirror. They suggest that the people who raised them may have been thinking less about legacy in the political sense, and more about continuity in the planetary sense. Modern civilization is structured around short feedback loops. Political cycles, economic growth, technological turnover, and even scientific paradigms operate on timescales measured in years or decades. Deep time is acknowledged intellectually but rarely integrated into decision-making. By contrast, Giza appears to embed deep time directly into its architecture. Cardinal orientation presumes a stable Earth. Stellar reference presumes predictable celestial mechanics. Bedrock foundations presume erosion, not avoidance. These are not the priorities of a culture obsessed with immediacy. This difference matters because it reframes the pyramids as warnings as much as achievements. A society that invests extraordinary resources into permanence may be responding to an awareness of fragility. The archaeological record increasingly supports the idea that prehistoric and early historic populations were highly sensitive to environmental change. They tracked seasonal shifts, monitored animal migrations, and adapted settlement patterns in response to rainfall variability. Over generations, such sensitivity could evolve into something more abstract and understanding that worlds can end without intention, and that survival depends on remembering why. In this sense, Giza functions as a boundary object between memory and anticipation. It does not simply commemorate the past, it anticipates future observers. The builders could not have known who would stand before the pyramids thousands of years later, but they could reasonably assume that the sky would still be there, the cardinal directions would still hold, and stone would still speak more reliably than words. That assumption has proven correct. Every serious attempt to explain Giza begins not with texts, but with measurements. This challenges a deeply rooted modern assumption that history progresses through accumulation alone. The pyramids imply an alternative model, one in which accumulation is punctuated by loss, and knowledge survives unevenly across disruptions. In such a model, monuments are not mere expressions of dominance, but stabilizing mechanisms. They hold ideas in place when institutions fail. They preserve orientation when narratives fracture. They act as fixed points against which future societies can recalibrate their understanding of the world. The resistance to this idea often takes the form of false dichotomies. Either the pyramids were built exactly as textbooks describe, or they must belong to a speculative lost civilization. Either erosion proves an earlier date, or it proves nothing at all. Such framing obscures a more plausible reality that the past is layered, adaptive, and partially opaque. It is entirely possible for monuments to be constructed within a known historical period, while embodying concepts, alignments, or symbolic references inherited from much earlier contexts. What ultimately distinguishes Giza from other ancient sites is not mystery alone, but restraint. The pyramids do not tell stories overtly. They do not instruct or persuade. They simply persist. This persistence invites projection, but it also disciplines interpretation. Any claim made about them must contend with the same constraints: mass orientation, erosion, and sky. They are not infinitely interpretable. They are stubbornly specific. As climate science continues to refine our understanding of Earth's past, the relevance of Giza may actually increase rather than diminish. We now know that abrupt climate transitions are not anomalies, but recurring features of planetary history. Sea levels rise and fall, rain belts migrate, habitable zones expand and contract. Human societies respond, adapt, collapse, and reorganize. Against this backdrop, the pyramids look less like isolated wonders and more like early experiments in resilience. They do not offer solutions, they offer continuity. They demonstrate that it is possible to think beyond immediate survival and to encode understanding into the environment itself. Whether the builders consciously intended this or arrived at it through cultural intuition is ultimately secondary. The result is the same, a structure that continues to provoke inquiry, long after its original social context has vanished. Giza does not demand belief in a single hidden history. It demands intellectual humility. It reminds us that our reconstructions of the past are provisional, shaped by the tools and assumptions of our own time. It also reminds us that earlier societies may have perceived risks and cycles that modern societies are only beginning to acknowledge again. In the end, the pyramids endure not because they solve the riddle of human origins, but because they preserve the question. They stand at the intersection of nature and intention, memory and measurement loss, and persistence. And by doing so, they quietly suggest that the most important legacy a civilization can leave behind is not dominance or expansion, but orientation away for those who come after, to understand where they are when they are and how fragile the world beneath their feet has always been. The relevance of Giza in the present moment lies not only in what it reveals about the past, but in how it reframes the relationship between civilization and environment. Modern societies tend to treat climate as a background variable, something to be managed, mitigated, or engineered around. For most of human history, climate was not background. It was the primary driver of migration, settlement, and collapse. The archaeological record increasingly shows that major cultural shifts often coincide with abrupt environmental change, not gradual social evolution. Giza sits squarely within this pattern. If the monuments encode anything enduring, it is the recognition that stability is temporary. The builders appear to have worked with this assumption rather than against it. Instead of constructing lightly and rebuilding often, they invested in mass alignment and geological anchoring. This choice suggests an understanding that conditions would change and that what mattered most was not adaptability alone, but preservation of orientation, keeping certain relationships intact even as surface realities transformed. Such thinking contrasts sharply with modern architectural logic, which prioritizes efficiency, speed, and replaceability. Structures today are rarely designed to survive beyond a century. In that context, the pyramids appear almost alien, not because of lost technology, but because of lost priorities. They were built with an implicit acceptance of decay elsewhere, coupled with a refusal to let everything decay. This selective permanence implies strategic memory rather than excess. The question of who the builders were becomes less significant than what they understood. They understood stone. They understood horizon lines. They understood how the sky changes slowly enough to function as a reference across generations. Whether this knowledge was inherited from earlier populations or developed locally over long periods of observation, it reflects an intimacy with natural cycles that modern societies have largely abstracted away. There is also a methodological lesson embedded in the Giza debate. Interdisciplinary inquiry is no longer optional when addressing deep history. Archaeology without climate science risks misreading context. Geology without cultural analysis risks misattribution. Astronomy without statistical rigor risks pattern projection. The pyramids force these disciplines into conversation precisely because no single one can fully account for them. That friction is productive. It slows interpretation and demands precision. As new technologies emerge, high-resolution satellite imaging, improved ground, penetrating radar, refined isotopic analysis, the plateau continues to yield data, not answers. Subsurface voids, anomalies in bedrock, and subtle variations in construction technique complicate the picture rather than simplifying it. Each discovery narrows certain possibilities while opening others. This is characteristic of mature scientific problems. Progress occurs not through revelation but through constraint. In this sense, Giza is less a mystery to be solved than a reference point to be revisited. Its value lies in its ability to recalibrate assumptions. It challenges the idea that civilization begins, cleanly progresses smoothly, and culminates predictably. Instead, it points toward a history shaped by interruption recovery and selective continuity. Some things vanish, some things persist. The reasons are not always cultural, often they are environmental. The enduring fascination with the pyramids is therefore not a failure of explanation, but a reflection of their function. They were built to endure inquiry as much as weather. They withstand erosion, reinterpretation, and skepticism alike. Each era approaches them with different tools and different anxieties, yet the structures remain relevant because they engage questions that do not expire. How long can knowledge last? What survives collapse? And what responsibilities come with awareness of deep time? Ultimately, Giza offers a quiet corrective to modern historical confidence. It reminds us that certainty is often temporary, that progress is neither guaranteed nor uniform, and that memory requires material support to survive disruption. The pyramids do not tell us what to believe about the past. They demonstrate how seriously at least one ancient society took the problem of the future. The final implication of Giza is not archaeological but existential. Once monuments are understood as responses to instability rather than celebrations of permanence, their meaning shifts. They become evidence of awareness that civilizations are vulnerable to forces beyond political control, and that memory itself requires defense. This perspective reframes ancient builders not as naive precursors to modernity, but as participants in the same struggle to endure uncertainty that defines human existence today. In this light, the pyramids function as thresholds rather than conclusions. They mark a point where observation, experience, and intention converged into something deliberately resistant to time. Their scale was not necessary for utility, nor was their precision required for ritual alone. Both suggest an attempt to step outside ordinary human temporality, to communicate across spans far exceeding individual lifetimes or dynastic reigns. This ambition aligns less with conquest than with caution. The refusal of the pyramids to offer explicit narrative may itself be intentional. Stories are easily distorted, translated, or erased. Geometry is not. Orientation is not. A future observer does not need to share language, religion, or culture to recognize cardinal alignment or stellar reference. In this way, Giza anticipates loss. It assumes that meaning will have to be reconstructed rather than inherited intact. That assumption has proven correct. This interpretation also dissolves the false opposition between science and myth. Myths are often dismissed as irrational, yet they frequently encode environmental memory floods, droughts, cycles of destruction and renewal into symbolic form. Science, by contrast, translates those memories into data and models. The pyramids sit at the intersection of these modes. They are material myths, preserving insight without explanation, waiting for analytical tools capable of reading them. What remains striking is how little is actually required to sustain this view. It does not depend on hidden chambers containing forbidden knowledge or on advanced technologies lost to time. It depends only on three propositions supported by evidence that Earth's climate has undergone abrupt civilization-altering shifts, that human groups have repeatedly adapted, migrated, and reorganized in response, and that durable structures are among the few carriers of long-term memory capable of surviving such transitions. Giza satisfies all three. As the modern world enters a period of accelerating environmental change, this realization gives the plateau renewed relevance. The pyramids no longer appear as distant relics of a completed past, but as artifacts from an earlier encounter with planetary instability. They invite reflection rather than awe. They ask not how they were built, but why such effort was devoted to endurance. History often treats ancient monuments as endpoints, the final achievements of vanished societies. Giza resists this framing. It feels more like a midpoint, something placed deliberately between what was lost and what might come next. Its builders could not prevent climate change, nor could they guarantee the survival of their culture. What they could do was fix orientation, preserve relationships, and leave behind a reference stable enough to be rediscovered. In that sense, the pyramids do not belong solely to ancient Egypt. They belong to any civilization confronting the reality that progress is fragile and memory is selective. They demonstrate that long-term thinking is not a modern invention, but an ancient response to lived experience, and they stand as a reminder that the most enduring human achievements may not be those that display power, but those that quietly acknowledge limits. The plateau remains not as proof of a single, hidden history, but as a challenge to linear thinking itself. It suggests that the past is not simply behind us, but beneath us, layered, compressed, and partially visible through what endures. Giza endures because it was built for that condition. It is less a monument to what once was than a structure designed to be found again when the world was ready to ask the same questions anew. The enduring significance of Giza ultimately rests on its ability to collapse distance between past and present, between environmental process and human intention, between survival and meaning. Few places force such a confrontation with time. Standing before the plateau, it becomes difficult to maintain the comforting assumption that human history unfolds in a steady arc of improvement. The pyramids insist on another possibility, that knowledge can peak fracture and reappear in altered forms, carried forward not by institutions, but by what resists erasure. This perspective reframes how civilization itself is defined. Conventional models emphasize agriculture writing metallurgy, and political hierarchy as markers of advancement. Yet Giza suggests that observational intelligence, the ability to read the sky, the land, and long environmental rhythms may be just as foundational. A society capable of embedding astronomical reference, geological awareness, and symbolic permanence into architecture demonstrates a form of sophistication that does not fit neatly into linear developmental charts. It implies competence without excess narrative intention, without documentation. The question then is not whether ancient people were advanced in a modern technological sense, but whether they were attuned. Attunement leaves fewer artifacts than machinery, but it leaves deeper traces. It shapes where monuments are placed, how they are oriented, and what materials are chosen. It produces architecture that feels less like an object and more like a relationship between land and sky, present and future. Giza reads as such a relationship stabilized in stone. This interpretation gains weight when placed alongside the broader pattern of prehistoric discoveries emerging across the globe. Sites once dismissed as anomalies now form a growing constellation of evidence suggesting that large-scale ritual and construction predate traditional timelines. These sites vary widely in culture and geography, yet they share certain traits: alignment to celestial events, integration with landscape, and a focus on durability rather than habitation. Together they point toward a phase of human behavior oriented less around accumulation and more around anchoring meaning in an unstable world. Giza, however, stands apart even within this category. Its scale and precision exceed what would be required for ritual gathering alone. The labour investment is extreme, the tolerances unusually tight, and the placement unusually deliberate. These features imply coordination across generations, not merely a burst of enthusiasm or belief. Such coordination suggests that the builders were operating within a long memory, one that valued continuity across disruptions rather than novelty within stability. This raises an uncomfortable implication for modern historical confidence. If ancient societies were capable of such long-range thinking, then the assumption that awareness of deep time is a modern achievement becomes untenable. The difference may not lie in what ancient people understood, but in what modern societies choose to prioritize. Where earlier cultures confronted environmental limits, directly contemporary systems often defer them, externalize them, or treat them as abstract risks rather than lived realities. In this context, Giza can be read as a form of environmental literacy made permanent. It encodes orientation rather than instruction, reference rather than command. It does not tell future observers what to do, but it provides a stable framework within which understanding can be rebuilt. This is a subtle but powerful distinction. Instruction fails when context changes. Reference endures. The absence of explicit explanation at Giza may therefore be its most sophisticated feature. By refusing to bind meaning to language, the builders ensured that interpretation would remain possible even after cultural rupture. Stone speaks in constraints, angles, alignments, proportions, erosion. These can be measured independently of belief. They allow future societies to ask new questions without erasing the old structure. In this way, Giza remains perpetually unfinished, not in construction but in interpretation. This openness has often been treated as a flaw inviting speculation and excess, yet it may be precisely what has allowed the site to remain intellectually active for so long. Closed systems decay when their assumptions fail. Open systems persist because they can be re-entered. Giza does not collapse under reinterpretation. It absorbs it. Each generation approaches the plateau with new tools, new anxieties, and new frameworks, and still finds something that resists dismissal. The deeper lesson may be that resilience is not achieved through prediction, but through design that anticipates misunderstanding. The builders of Giza could not know future languages, sciences, or worldviews. What they could do was construct something that would still invite inquiry regardless of those variables. That is an extraordinary act of foresight, one rooted not in certainty, but in humility, a recognition that survival depends on leaving room for reinterpretation. As the modern world confronts accelerating ecological uncertainty, this lesson acquires renewed urgency. Civilizations today produce vast amounts of data, but relatively little that is designed to survive beyond institutional collapse. Digital records degrade. Infrastructure is optimized for short-term efficiency. Knowledge is stored in formats that assume continuity of power and technology. Against this backdrop, Giza appears almost corrective, reminding us that endurance requires material commitment and conceptual restraint. The pyramids do not offer a blueprint for modern society. They offer a perspective. They demonstrate that human beings have long grappled with impermanence and that some chose to respond by fixing orientation rather than outcomes. They chose to leave behind a question rather than an answer, trusting that future observers would possess the curiosity to engage with it. In the end, Giza endures, not because it resolves the debate over lost civilizations or precise chronology, but because it reframes what survival means. It suggests that continuity is not the preservation of everything, but the preservation of enough structure, enough reference, enough orientation for understanding to re-emerge after disruption. That insight carved into stone at the edge of the desert may be one of the most enduring contributions any civilization has ever made. The final perspective Giza offers emerges when the site is considered not as an archaeological puzzle to be solved, but as a long-term interface between human intelligence and planetary reality. Most ancient structures are bound to their cultural moment. Once belief systems fade, their purpose becomes obscure. Giza resists that fate. Its meaning does not rely on ritual practice, royal lineage, or textual continuity. It rests on relationships that remain legible, regardless of era orientation, proportion horizon, and D sky. In this way, the plateau functions less like a relic and more like a calibration point embedded in the landscape. This distinction matters because it suggests that the builders were not merely responding to their present circumstances, but to anticipated discontinuity. Civilizations that assume permanence invest in expansion and ornamentation. Civilizations that anticipate rupture invest in anchors. The pyramids display the logic of anchoring. They do not sprawl outward, they compress inward. They reduce complexity to essentials. They minimize decoration while maximizing constraint. Every major decision favors survivability over expression. Such choices imply an awareness that expression decays quickly, while structure endures. The contrast with later monumental traditions is instructive. Subsequent Egyptian temples became increasingly elaborate, saturated with inscriptions, reliefs, and mythological narratives. These were powerful tools of statecraft, but they were also vulnerable to erasure. When political authority collapsed or belief systems shifted, much of that meaning became opaque. Giza predates this saturation. It stands apart as a moment when monumentality was still experimental, still stripped to fundamentals. The result is architecture that speaks more clearly across deep time than many later, more expressive constructions. This clarity is not accidental. Geometry, unlike iconography, does not require cultural translation. A right angle remains a right angle. Cardinal alignment remains verifiable. Proportional relationships remain testable. The pyramids communicate through these invariants. They assume that future observers will possess the capacity to measure, even if they lack the context to interpret. That assumption reflects a profound confidence in human curiosity rather than in cultural continuity. The question of why such confidence existed leads back to environmental experience. Societies shaped by long periods of stability tend to imagine continuity as default. Societies shaped by disruption learn otherwise. Paleoclimate data indicates that the late Pleistocene and early Holocene were punctuated by sharp transitions that unfolded within human lifetimes. For populations living through such changes, the world would not have felt predictable. Rivers moved, rain belts shifted, habitats disappeared. In that context, memory itself becomes precarious. Oral transmission can fracture under displacement. Ritual can be interrupted. Architecture becomes one of the few reliable vessels for continuity. Giza appears to embody this logic. Its builders selected a site above the floodplain anchored to bedrock, positioned at a liminal zone between desert and river. The choice was practical but also symbolic. It placed permanence at the boundary between fertility and desolation, stability and flux. That boundary would have been meaningful to people whose lives were shaped by shifting environments. It is not difficult to imagine why such a location would acquire cosmological significance. This reading reframes debates about intention. Instead of asking whether the pyramids were tombs, observatories or memorials, a more productive question emerges: what problem were they trying to solve? The answer must be deceptively simple. They were solving the problem of continuity under conditions where continuity could not be assumed. Their solution was not narrative preservation but spatial reference. Not instruction, but orientation. They left behind a structure that future societies could use to re-establish bearings after disruption. Seen this way, the pyramids become less about death and more about recovery. Even if they functioned within funerary ideology during the Old Kingdom, that function may have been layered onto a deeper architectural logic. Cultures often repurpose inherited forms, integrating them into new symbolic systems, without erasing their original structural intent. The endurance of Giza across successive reinterpretations suggests that its foundational design was robust enough to accommodate such layering. This layered endurance complicates modern attempts to assign singular meaning. Giza does not resolve into one function because it was designed to operate across multiple contexts. It could be sacred without being didactic. It could be royal without being propagandistic. It could be cosmological without requiring explicit explanation. Such multifunctionality is a hallmark of resilient design. It allows structures to remain relevant even as societies change. The persistence of debate itself may therefore be part of the monument's success. Giza continues to generate inquiry because it resists closure. Each generation approaches it with new methods, surveying instruments, satellite imagery, climate models, astronomical simulations, and finds that, while some questions narrow, others widen. This is not failure. It is the behavior of a well-designed reference system. It does not exhaust itself when one interpretation is applied. Modern societies often equate progress with accumulation of information. Giza suggests an alternative metric, the capacity to transmit orientation rather than data. Information decays quickly when systems collapse. Orientation can survive. A civilization that preserves orientation preserves the possibility of rebuilding understanding, even if specific knowledge is lost. This is a subtle but profound distinction, one that challenges contemporary assumptions about what it means to leave a legacy. As environmental instability becomes a defining feature of the present century, this distinction gains urgency. Modern infrastructure is optimized for efficiency, not endurance. Knowledge is digitized, centralized, and dependent on continuous energy flows. Few structures are designed with the expectation that future societies may need to reconstruct understanding without access to current systems. In this sense, Giza exposes a vulnerability in modern thinking. It demonstrates that earlier societies, often characterized as technologically primitive, may have been more realistic about fragility. The pyramids do not romanticize the past. They do not suggest that ancient societies were immune to collapse. On the contrary, their very existence implies awareness of loss. They are artifacts of anticipation, not triumph. They acknowledge that worlds end, that landscapes transform, and that continuity must be engineered rather than assumed. This acknowledgement aligns closely with contemporary scientific understanding, even though it was expressed through architecture rather than models. In the end, the enduring value of Giza lies in its refusal to be exhausted by explanation. It stands as evidence that human beings have long grappled with the same fundamental questions that confront modern civilization: how to survive change, how to preserve meaning, and how to communicate across time when language cannot be trusted. The pyramids do not answer these questions definitively. They embody a response to them. That response is quiet, deliberate, and materially grounded. It does not rely on faith in permanence, but on acceptance of impermanence. It does not attempt to control the future, but to remain intelligible to it. In doing so, Giza transcends its cultural origin and becomes a shared human artifact, one that continues to speak not through words, but through alignment, endurance, and the enduring human impulse to orient ourselves in a world that refuses to stand still. The broader implication of Giza, when carried to its furthest logical conclusion, is that human history may be better understood as a sequence of recoveries, rather than a record of uninterrupted ascent. Archaeological narratives often emphasize origins, the first cities, the first writing, the first states. Yet recovery is harder to document than origin. It leaves fewer artifacts, fewer texts, and fewer clear transitions. Giza may belong to this less visible category. It appears not at the start of a story, but at a moment when something had already been lost and continuity needed to be re-established. This interpretation aligns with a growing recognition in historical science that collapse does not imply disappearance. Populations rarely vanish outright. They fragment, migrate, adapt, and reorganize. Knowledge does not evaporate. It degrades, becomes uneven, and reappears in altered forms. Monumental architecture may therefore function less as evidence of peak complexity and more as a response to vulnerability. It is built when continuity is threatened, not when it is assured. In this context, the pyramids appear as artifacts of consolidation. They gather dispersed knowledge, astronomical observation, stoneworking surveying symbolic geometry, and fix it into a single stable configuration. This act does not require global dominance or advanced machinery. It requires long memory coordination across generations and a shared understanding that certain relationships must not be lost. The result is not technological spectacle, but structural clarity. The emphasis on precision at Giza supports this reading. Precision is costly. It consumes labour and attention without immediately increasing utility. A roughly oriented pyramid would still function symbolically as a tomb or monument. A precisely oriented one suggests another priority, the preservation of reference. North must remain north. Proportions must remain readable. These constraints transform the structure into a measuring device of sorts, capable of reasserting orientation even after cultural rupture. Such priorities make sense for societies shaped by environmental instability. When landscapes change rapidly, orientation becomes survival critical. Knowing where the sun rises when seasons shift and how cycles repeat is not abstract knowledge. It is adaptive intelligence. Embedding that intelligence into architecture ensures that it remains accessible even if social transmission fails. The pyramid becomes a mnemonic anchored in stone. This perspective also reframes the role of religion at Giza. Religious language often dominates discussion of ancient monuments, but belief systems are fluid. They evolve, merge, and dissolve. What persists beneath them are structural metaphors: cycles, renewal, ascent, alignment. These metaphors can be reinterpreted without altering the underlying form. The pyramids may have supported funerary ideology in the Old Kingdom, but that ideology does not exhaust their function. It may represent a later narrative layer imposed on an earlier architectural logic. The tension between architectural evidence and textual silence reinforces this possibility. Unlike later Egyptian monuments, Giza lacks extensive inscriptions explaining purpose or authorship. This absence is often explained by theological convention, yet it also prevents the structure from being locked into a single narrative. Meaning remains negotiable. The monument survives not as doctrine, but as a framework within which doctrines can be built and discarded. From a methodological standpoint, this challenges modern historical comfort with categorization. Scholars prefer to assign artifacts to periods, cultures, and functions. Giza resists this impulse. Its construction techniques fit within Old Kingdom capabilities, yet its conceptual horizon appears broader. Its environmental context reaches deep into prehistory, yet its visible form belongs to a later era. It occupies a liminal position that complicates tidy classification. Such liminality is not unique to Giza, but Giza amplifies it. Other ancient sites show signs of reuse adaptation and layered meaning. What distinguishes the plateau is the scale at which this layering operates. The entire landscape functions as a composed system: pyramids, causeways, temples, bedrock, and horizon integrated into a single spatial statement. This integration suggests planning that transcended immediate political needs. The idea that ancient societies thought in terms of long cycles rather than linear progress is increasingly supported by comparative anthropology. Many traditional cultures conceptualize time as repeating regenerative and responsive to natural rhythms. Catastrophe in such systems is not an anomaly but a phase. Memory is preserved not to prevent recurrence but to survive it. Giza appears compatible with this worldview. It does not deny impermanence, it accommodates it. Modern resistance to this view often stems from an implicit hierarchy of knowledge. Technological sophistication is valued over environmental attunement. Written records are privileged over material memory. Yet the archaeological record increasingly shows that material memory is often more reliable across deep time. Texts burn, languages die, stone remains altered but legible. The pyramids embody this reality. As a result, Giza challenges not only historical timelines but historical priorities. It suggests that the most consequential achievements of a civilization may not be those that expand territory or accumulate wealth, but those that preserve orientation when systems fail. This is a humbling insight. It implies that progress as conventionally defined may be less important than resilience. The plateau therefore stands as a counterpoint to modern narratives of inevitability. It does not imply that civilizations naturally advance toward greater complexity. It implies that complexity is episodic, contingent, and reversible. What matters is not how high a society rises, but how well it prepares for descent. The pyramids do not prevent descent. They endure through it. In this sense, Giza is not a relic of ancient certainty, but a monument to uncertainty managed with discipline. It reflects a decision to invest in what would last when other things would not. That decision resonates powerfully in an age confronting its own environmental thresholds. The pyramids remind us that awareness of fragility is not new, and that long-term thinking has deep roots in human experience. The final lesson of Giza may therefore be neither mystery nor revelation but proportion. It places human ambition within planetary context. It measures civilization against climate, time, and sky. And it suggests that the most enduring dialogue between humanity and the world is not spoken in words, but carved into the structures we choose to leave behind when we understand that the future will not look like the present. The long arc traced by Giza ultimately brings the discussion back to a question that modern historical frameworks rarely ask. What does it mean to remember responsibly? Memory in this sense is not nostalgia or preservation of detail, but the capacity to retain orientation when circumstances fundamentally change. The pyramids do not preserve names, events, or doctrines with clarity. Instead, they preserve relationships between land and sky structure, and horizon mass and time. This choice reflects a form of historical intelligence that prioritizes what remains meaningful when most other things fail. Modern reconstructions of the past tend to privilege causality. We ask what led to what, which innovation enabled which outcome, which ruler commissioned which monument. Giza resists this approach because its most striking features are not causal, but relational. The pyramids do not point backward to a single origin. They point outward to a context. They situate human activity within larger systems, planetary motion, geological stability, climatic rhythm. In doing so, they shift the emphasis from agency to alignment. This shift has important implications for how civilization is understood. Agency-driven histories assume control. Humans shape the world through ingenuity and power. Alignment-driven histories assume negotiation. Humans adapt to forces they do not command. The architecture of Giza aligns with the latter. Its builders did not attempt to dominate the environment. They worked with its constraints bedrock latitude horizon cardinal directions and embedded those constraints into their design. The result is not an assertion of mastery but an acknowledgement of limits. Such an acknowledgement suggests that the builders were acutely aware of vulnerability. This awareness does not need to stem from a single cataclysmic event. It can arise gradually through accumulated experience of environmental fluctuation, resource stress, and social fragility. Over generations, these experiences could crystallize into a worldview that treats stability as provisional and continuity as something that must be actively engineered. In this worldview, architecture becomes a form of long-term communication. Not communication in the sense of instruction, but in the sense of availability. The pyramids make certain information continuously available, where north is where the sun rises, how mass behaves over time, how stone responds to erosion. They do not require interpretation to function. They simply remain. This availability allows future societies to reconstruct understanding, even if intermediate knowledge has been lost. This may explain why Giza appears so resistant to definitive explanation. It was not designed to resolve questions, but to support them. A monument built to communicate a fixed message would need that message encoded explicitly. A monument built to preserve orientation needs only to preserve form. The latter approach is far more robust across deep time. It accepts that future observers will bring their own frameworks, tools, and concerns. It does not attempt to control interpretation. It ensures that interpretation remains possible. The persistence of debate around Giza is therefore not a failure of scholarship but a feature of the monument's design. Each new discipline that engages with the site, astronomy, geology, climate science, engineering, finds something relevant because the monument operates at their intersection. It does not belong exclusively to any one domain. This interdisciplinarity is not accidental. It reflects a holistic understanding of reality that predates modern specialization. From this perspective, the question of whether the pyramids were built by a lost civilization becomes secondary. What matters is that the builders thought beyond immediate continuity. They invested in a structure whose primary function was to endure inquiry. That investment paid off. Thousands of years later, the pyramids still provoke analysis, still challenge assumptions, still force reconsideration of human timelines and priorities. This endurance invites comparison with modern knowledge systems. Contemporary societies generate vast quantities of information, yet much of it is fragile. It depends on continuous energy supply, institutional stability, and technological compatibility. When those conditions fail, information collapses rapidly. By contrast, the pyramids preserve minimal information with maximal resilience. They do not store data, they store reference. They do not explain, they orient. This contrast exposes a potential blind spot in modern thinking. We often equate progress with accumulation and detail. Giza suggests that progress may also involve reduction, distilling what matters most and fixing it into forms that survive disruption. This is not an argument against complexity, but an argument for balance. Complex systems require simple anchors if they are to be reconstituted after collapse. The ethical dimension of this insight is difficult to ignore. If ancient societies understood the fragility of continuity well enough to build for deep time, what does that imply about modern responsibilities? The pyramids do not accuse, they do not instruct, but they stand as evidence that long-term thinking is not only possible but ancient. They undermine the excuse that concern for distant futures is an unrealistic luxury. In the end, Giza does not offer certainty about the past. It offers perspective on time. It suggests that civilizations are chapters, not volumes, and that meaning survives not through dominance but through restraint. The builders of the pyramids did not attempt to control the future. They attempted to remain legible to it. This may be the most profound legacy of the plateau. It demonstrates that when humans accept impermanence as a given rather than a threat, they can design responses that transcend their immediate context. The pyramids are such a response. They are not monuments to a finished world, but to a world understood as cyclical, contingent, and worth remembering carefully. In that sense, Giza continues to function exactly as intended. It stands quietly absorbing time, inviting each generation to measure itself against something older, slower and more patient than any civilization. It does not tell us who we were. It asks whether we understand where we are and whether we are capable of thinking far enough ahead to deserve to be understood by those who come after. The unresolved nature of Giza's meaning has often been treated as a problem to be solved, but it may be more accurate to see it as a condition to be maintained. Many ancient monuments lose relevance once their original function is understood, and Giza has not followed that pattern. Instead, each apparent clarification opens further questions, not because of a lack of data, but because the structure itself operates on scales that resist closure. It is this resistance that has kept the site intellectually alive across centuries. One reason for this persistence lies in the way the pyramids integrate time into their physical form. Most human constructions are designed for use within a narrow temporal window. Their materials, dimensions, and tolerances assume maintenance, replacement, or obsolescence. The pyramids do not. Their mass anticipates erosion, their geometry tolerates loss, and their alignment remains legible even after surface degradation. Time is not an external threat acting upon them. It is a variable already accounted for in their design. This suggests that the builders understood decay not as failure but as process. Weathering, sand accumulation, and stone loss were not unforeseen consequences, but inevitable outcomes. Rather than attempting to prevent these processes entirely, the architecture ensures that they do not compromise the core structure. The essential relationships between base and apex, between orientation and horizon, survive even as detail disappears. In this sense, the pyramids function less like buildings and more like geological features shaped intentionally rather than accidentally. Such thinking challenges modern assumptions about technological sophistication. Advanced capability is often equated with a complexity automation or miniaturization. The pyramids demonstrate a different form of sophistication, one rooted in scale patience and material literacy. The builders selected limestone and granite not merely for availability but for their long-term behavior under stress. They understood load distribution settling and fracture patterns without formal equations, relying instead on empirical knowledge accumulated over generations. This kind of knowledge does not emerge quickly. It requires continuity of observation and transmission across long spans of time. Whether or not this continuity extended back to the younger Dryas or earlier periods remains debated, but the pyramids themselves imply that such continuity existed. Precision at the level seen at Giza cannot be achieved through improvisation. It reflects stable traditions of measurement, calibration, and correction refined over centuries. The same logic applies to the astronomical aspects of the site. Aligning massive stone structures to cardinal directions with such accuracy requires not only observation, but repetition. Single observations are insufficient. Only long-term tracking reveals the slow movements of stars and the subtle drift of celestial reference points. This again points to an inherited body of knowledge, rather than a sudden breakthrough. Knowledge here appears cumulative, conservative, and carefully curated. Importantly, this conservatism does not imply stagnation. On the contrary, it reflects an understanding that some insights are too valuable to discard. Modern cultures often valorize innovation over retention, assuming that new solutions will always supersede old ones. The architecture of Giza suggests a different hierarchy, one in which stability is as prized as novelty. Change occurs, but within a framework designed to preserve essential orientation. This framework also shapes how the pyramids interact with human perception. Standing before them, scale overwhelms detail. Individual blocks become irrelevant. What dominates is proportion, symmetry, and mass. This perceptual effect is not incidental. It encourages a shift away from personal or political narratives toward more abstract considerations. The observer is confronted not with a story, but with a conditioned endurance. That endurance has psychological consequences. It destabilizes the sense of temporal centrality that modern societies often assume. When confronted with a structure that has already survived multiple collapses of political order, technological systems, and environmental regimes, contemporary achievements appear provisional. This does not diminish their value, but it places them in context. The pyramids do not negate progress, they relativize it. Such relativization may be one of their most important functions. Civilizations that believe themselves permanent tend to behave differently from those that recognize their fragility. The builders of Giza appear to have belonged to the latter category. Their architecture does not celebrate conquest or expansion. It does not depict enemies or victories. It focuses instead on continuity through uncertainty, a theme echoed in later Egyptian cosmology, but expressed here in material rather than mythic form. The absence of explicit inscriptions within the Great Pyramid reinforces this interpretation. Writing fixes meaning in language which is itself vulnerable to loss and reinterpretation. Geometry, by contrast, is more resilient. A right angle remains a right angle regardless of language. Cardinal directions remain meaningful even if cultural symbols vanish. By encoding significance geometrically rather than textually, the builders ensured that future societies could still engage with the monument, even if all contextual knowledge were lost. This strategy reveals a deep awareness of historical discontinuity. It assumes that memory will fragment, that traditions will break, and that languages will die. Instead of attempting to preserve everything, the builders selected what could survive those breaks. In doing so, they implicitly acknowledged that forgetting is inevitable, but total erasure is not. Something always remains if it is placed carefully enough. Modern archaeology, with its emphasis on reconstruction, often seeks to restore lost contexts. This work is valuable, but it can obscure another lesson of Giza, that not all knowledge is meant to be reconstructed. Some knowledge is meant to remain latent, becoming relevant only when conditions align. The pyramids may function in this way, revealing different aspects of themselves as human understanding evolves. What once appeared purely symbolic later reveals astronomical or engineering significance as analytical tools improve. This dynamic relationship between monument and observer ensures that Giza never becomes obsolete. It adapts not by changing, but by being reinterpreted. Each generation brings new questions, and the structure accommodates them without exhaustion. Few human creations possess this capacity. Most are exhausted once their function is understood. Giza endures precisely because its function is not singular. Ultimately, the significance of the pyramids may lie less in what they tell us about the past than in what they suggest about responsibility toward the future. They demonstrate that it is possible to act with awareness of deep time to design, not just for immediate use, but for interpretability across millennia. This awareness does not require certainty about what will come next. It requires only the humility to accept that change is inevitable, and the discipline to prepare for it. In this light, the pyramids are not relics of a vanished world, but instruments of continuity. They stand as evidence that long-term thinking is not a modern invention, but an ancient practice, one that recognized limits, respected cycles, and chose endurance over excess. Their silence is not emptiness, but restraint, and within that restraint lies a form of knowledge still relevant to any civilization that wonders how to persist without assuming permanence. The final challenge posed by Dryas is not technical, but philosophical. After centuries of measurement, debate, and reinterpretation, the site resists any single conclusion. This resistance is often framed as a failure of evidence or method, yet it may instead reflect the nature of the object itself. Giza does not behave like a puzzle designed to be solved once and then set aside. It behaves more like a boundary marking the limits of what certain forms of knowledge can fully capture. Modern inquiry tends to privilege clarity and closure. Questions are valued insofar as they can be answered, definitively hypotheses insofar as they can be tested and resolved. The pyramids complicate this framework. Each domain that approaches them, archaeology, geology, astronomy, engineering, produces valid insights, yet none can fully subsume the monument into its explanatory system. The result is not contradiction, but incompleteness. Giza remains coherent, but never exhausted. This incompleteness has often been treated as an invitation to speculation. While speculative excess can obscure serious inquiry, it also reveals something important: people sense that the monument exceeds ordinary categories. That intuition persists even when unsupported by evidence. Rather than dismissing it outright, it is worth asking why such intuitions recur. They may reflect not hidden technologies or lost civilizations, but an encounter with scale, temporal, spatial, and conceptual that destabilizes habitual modes of thought. One source of this destabilization is deep time. Human cognition evolved to manage lifespans measured in decades, histories measured in generations. The pyramids operate on a different register. Their continued presence collapses distinctions between ancient and modern, past and present. They are not artifacts encountered only through records. They are physical realities that intrude into contemporary landscapes. This immediacy makes deep time tangible, rather than abstract. When deep time becomes tangible, assumptions about progress are unsettled. Progress narratives depend on linear accumulation, on the idea that later stages supersede earlier ones. Giza complicates this by presenting an early construction that remains unmatched in certain respects. This does not imply regression or lost superiority, but it does challenge simplistic models of advancement. It suggests that different eras may optimize for different values, and that some values' durability, alignment, restraint do not align neatly with modern priorities. Another destabilizing factor is intentional ambiguity. Many ancient structures communicate through iconography or inscription, clearly situating themselves within cultural narratives. The Great Pyramid, by contrast, offers almost nothing in this regard. Its silence is not accidental. By withholding explicit explanation, it prevents later cultures from fully appropriating its meaning. Each society must confront it on its own terms, bringing its own questions, rather than inheriting fixed answers. This may explain why the monument has been repeatedly reinterpreted rather than assimilated. Dynastic Egyptians ritualized it, Greeks speculated about it, medieval travelers mythologized it, modern scientists measured it. None of these approaches erased the previous ones. Instead, meanings accumulated without resolution. The pyramid absorbed them without being reduced by them. Such absorption implies an unusual relationship between material form and interpretation. Most structures are diminished by reinterpretation. They become symbols detached from their original function. Giza seems to function oppositely. Interpretation increases its significance without fixing it. Each layer of analysis adds depth rather than narrowing scope. This is a rare property in human constructions. From this perspective, the Great Pyramid functions less as an answer than as a question made durable. It asks what kind of knowledge survives, collapse, what forms of communication persist, when languages disappear, and how intentional design can engage with futures it cannot predict. These are not questions that admit simple solutions. They are questions meant to endure. The ethical implications of this endurance are often overlooked. To build with awareness of deep time is to accept responsibility beyond one's own generation. It implies care not only for contemporaries but for unknown descendants. Whether or not the builders consciously frame their work in ethical terms, the result embodies a long-term orientation that contrasts sharply with many modern practices which prioritize speed, efficiency, and short-term gain. This contrast is not meant to romanticize the past or condemn the present. Rather, it highlights a divergence in temporal imagination. The builders of Giza appear to have imagined futures in which they would be absent, their intentions forgotten, yet their work still encountered. Designing for such futures requires humility. It assumes loss and misinterpretation as givens, not failures. Modern societies equipped with far more powerful technologies rarely design with comparable humility. Infrastructure is often planned on scales of decades rather than millennia. Data storage assumes continual maintenance. Knowledge preservation depends on fragile digital systems. Against this backdrop, Giza appears not primitive but conservative in the deeper sense, conserving meaning, by embedding it in matter rather than medium. This may be why the monument continues to provoke unease as well as admiration. It reveals a discrepancy between what modern civilizations can do and what they choose to do. Capability has expanded, but patience has contracted. The pyramids expose that contraction not through argument, but through presence. In the end, Giza does not compel belief in a lost golden age or forgotten super-civilization. It compels reflection on continuity, restraint, and scale. Its greatest achievement may not be technical precision or astronomical alignment, but the successful transmission of significance across profound discontinuity. It remains legible without being explicit, meaningful without being decoded. As long as the pyramids stand, they will continue to unsettle narratives that place the present at the center of history. They remind us that civilizations rise within larger cycles, that knowledge can be preserved without being explained, and that endurance itself can be a form of communication. In that sense, Giza does not belong solely to the past. It occupies a narrow, persistent bridge between what is, and what may yet come, silent, measured, and deliberately unfinished. After examining Giza as structure, instrument, and philosophical boundary, the remaining task is to consider how such a monument should reshape the way history itself is understood. The pyramids do not simply add an anomaly to the human record. They challenge the narrative framework through which that record is usually interpreted. They suggest that the story of civilization is not best told as a smooth ascent, but as a series of fluctuations shaped by memory, environment, and selective continuity. Traditional historical models rely on linear progression. They move from simple to complex, from small communities to centralized states, from improvisation to mastery. These models are useful, but they describe averages rather than limits. Giza exists near those limits. It does not conform to a gradualist narrative, yet it does not require myths of vanished super-civilizations to be meaningful. Instead, it points toward a more nuanced reality. Human capability has always existed within ranges that expand and contract depending on conditions, priorities, and what knowledge is successfully carried forward. This perspective forces a reconsideration of what terms like advanced or primitive actually mean. If a society is capable of organizing large populations, managing materials at extreme scale, tracking celestial cycles with precision, and building structures designed to remain intelligible for thousands of years, then sophistication cannot be measured solely by metallurgy writing systems or machines. Those are expressions of specialization, not universal benchmarks. Giza suggests that different societies may excel along different dimensions, and that excellence in one domain does not require dominance in all others. The pyramids also expose a weakness in how modern history treats loss. Collapse is often framed as an endpoint, a failure from which progress must restart. Yet the archaeological and environmental record increasingly shows that collapse is a phase, not a conclusion. Populations adapt, migrate, fragment, and reassemble. Knowledge persists unevenly, sometimes in altered or reduced forms, sometimes embedded in practices rather than texts. Giza fits comfortably within this pattern. It looks less like the origin of a civilization, and more like a stabilizing response to instability. Seen through this lens, monumental architecture becomes less about power and more about insurance. Building at such scale is costly and risky, especially in uncertain environments. The decision to do so implies that something is perceived as worth preserving beyond the immediate horizon, that something need not be political authority or religious doctrine. It can be orientation, measurement, or a way of situating human life within larger cycles. The pyramids appear to prioritize these abstract continuities over specific narratives. This priority challenges the assumption that meaning must always be explicit to endure. Modern cultures rely heavily on documentation, explanation, and instruction. When these systems fail, meaning often collapses with them. Giza demonstrates an alternative strategy, preserving conditions for understanding rather than content. By fixing relationships in space north and south horizon and zenith, base and apex, the builders ensured that future observers could reconstruct context even if intent was forgotten. This is a subtle but powerful form of foresight. Such foresight also implies restraint. The pyramids do not attempt to encode every belief or achievement. They reduce complexity rather than multiplying it. This reduction is not a limitation, but a strategy. Complexity is fragile. Simplicity, when carefully chosen, is resilient. In choosing geometry over inscription, mass over ornament, and alignment over narrative, the builders maximize the chances that something meaningful would survive disruption. This approach stands in contrast to many modern practices which assume continuity as a given. Infrastructure, knowledge systems, and cultural memory are often designed on the assumption that future societies will resemble the present closely enough to inherit them intact. Giza suggests that this assumption is historically naive. Past societies appear to have been more willing to accept discontinuity as inevitable and to design accordingly. That willingness may explain why their monuments still matter. Importantly, this interpretation does not diminish later historical achievements. The civilizations that inherited Giza added layers of meaning, ritual, and narrative that enriched human culture in other ways. What it does is relocate originality. Innovation does not always mean creating something entirely new. Sometimes it means recognizing what must not be lost, and finding a way to secure it against forces beyond human control. The pyramids therefore invite a shift in historical emphasis. Instead of asking only how civilizations rise, they encourage inquiry into how civilizations remember. Instead of focusing solely on accumulation, they foreground selection, what is chosen to endure when not everything can. This is a more demanding question because it admits limits. It acknowledges that no society can preserve all it knows, only what it decides is essential. In this sense, Giza becomes less a monument to ancient achievement than a mirror held up to modern assumptions. It asks whether contemporary societies, despite vastly greater technical power, are thinking as carefully about endurance. It raises the possibility that progress without long-term orientation may be as vulnerable as ignorance, and it suggests that the most durable contributions to human history may not be those that display mastery, but those that quietly preserve the conditions for understanding after mastery has failed. The pyramids remain because they were built for a world that could change. They assume loss without despair and continuity without certainty. That assumption, more than any specific function or date, may explain why they continue to matter. They do not tell a finished story. They establish a reference point and allow history, science, and meaning to reorganize around it as many times as necessary. The story suggested by Giza ultimately turns attention away from monuments themselves and toward the societies that choose to build them. Architecture at this scale is never accidental. It reflects collective agreement about what matters enough to demand sacrifice, coordination, and patience. The pyramids therefore reveal less about isolated genius than about shared priorities. They are evidence that a large group of people accepted long-term thinking as a legitimate and necessary undertaking. This acceptance carries implications that reach far beyond ancient Egypt. It suggests that early societies were capable of conceptualizing futures they would never inhabit, and of acting meaningfully on behalf of those futures. Such behavior contradicts the common assumption that concern for distant outcomes is a modern development tied to scientific forecasting. Instead, Giza implies that long-range responsibility may emerge naturally in cultures shaped by environmental uncertainty and repeated disruption. The effort invested in the pyramids becomes more comprehensible when viewed through this lens. Massive stone blocks, precise alignment and integration with bedrock all signal an intention to resist disappearance. These choices are inefficient if judged by short-term utility, but highly rational if the goal is persistence across unpredictable conditions. The builders appear to have accepted that most human endeavours vanish quickly, and to have responded by concentrating effort where survival was most likely. This concentration required discipline. It meant limiting decoration, resisting narrative excess, and favouring form over expression. Such restraint is rare in monumental traditions, which often emphasize display and distinction. At Giza, distinction arises not from ornament, but from proportion and placement. The effect is austere rather than dramatic, suggesting a deliberate rejection of transient markers of status in favour of something quieter and more durable. That quietness has allowed the pyramids to outlast not only dynasties but interpretive frameworks. They have survived religious transformation, political collapse, colonial reinterpretation, and scientific revision without losing relevance. Each era approaches them differently, yet none exhausts their significance. This endurance is not the result of mystery alone, but of structural openness. The pyramids do not enforce meaning, they invite it. Such openness may be intentional. A monument that prescribes interpretation risks becoming obsolete once its assumptions fail. A monument that preserves reference remains useful regardless of belief. Giza appears to embody the latter strategy. It anchors orientation rather than doctrine. It maintains relationships rather than messages. In doing so, it allows future societies to reconstruct context even when content has been lost. This strategy reflects a sophisticated understanding of how knowledge survives. Information is fragile when tied to specific systems. Orientation is robust because it relies on invariance. The sun rises, the horizon holds, gravity behaves predictably. By aligning architecture to these constants, the builders ensure that their work would remain intelligible even if everything else changed. This is not technological sophistication in the modern sense, but epistemic sophistication, knowledge about knowledge. The relevance of this insight becomes clearer when placed against the backdrop of contemporary civilization. Modern societies possess unprecedented technical power, yet much of their knowledge infrastructure is precarious. Digital systems depend on energy maintenance and compatibility. Cultural memory is fragmented across formats that assume continuity. Few artifacts are designed to remain meaningful without active support. In contrast, the pyramids require nothing but time. This contrast invites uncomfortable reflection. It suggests that the ability to store vast amounts of information does not guarantee the ability to preserve understanding. Accumulation can coexist with fragility. Giza demonstrates an alternative approach, reducing what is preserved in order to preserve it better. This reduction is not loss but selection guided by long-term awareness. The builder's willingness to select implies acceptance of limits. They did not attempt to encode their entire worldview. They chose instead to secure a framework within which future understanding could emerge. This choice required humility. It assumed that future observers would differ from them, misunderstand them, and reinterpret their work. Rather than resisting that inevitability, the architecture accommodates it. Such accommodation suggests that the builders did not imagine themselves as the final chapter of history. They anticipated being surpassed, forgotten, and rediscovered. This anticipation aligns with the cyclical view of time common in many ancient cultures, in which destruction and renewal are recurring phases rather than anomalies. Giza fits comfortably within such a worldview. It does not promise permanence of society, only persistence of reference. The persistence of reference carries ethical weight. It implies responsibility toward unknown others. Building for deep time requires acting without expectation of recognition or reward. It is labour performed for beneficiaries who cannot reciprocate. This is a form of altruism rarely acknowledged in discussions of ancient power structures, yet it may be one of the most significant aspects of monumental construction at Giza. The pyramids therefore challenge simplistic moral readings of the past. They are often framed as products of exploitation or domination, yet such framings do not fully explain their design logic. Exploitation may supply labour, but it does not account for restraint alignment or redundancy. These features point to shared commitment rather than mere coercion. They suggest participation in a project perceived as meaningful beyond individual lifetimes. In the end, the significance of Giza may lie not in what it proves about lost civilizations or precise chronologies, but in what it reveals about human capacity for foresight. It demonstrates that societies with limited technology by modern standards could nonetheless think carefully about durability, continuity, and responsibility across time. That capacity has not vanished, but it is often overshadowed by short-term imperatives. The pyramids endure as reminders that endurance itself can be a deliberate choice. They show that it is possible to act meaningfully under uncertainty, to accept impermanence without surrendering to it, and to preserve orientation when narratives fail. In doing so, they offer not a lesson to be learned once, but a standard against which each civilization may measure its own willingness to think beyond the present moment. We've reached the edge of tonight's journey, traveller. The stones of Giza recede back into shadow, and the questions we carried across ages and climates grow quieter, not answered, but held. The pyramids remain where they have always been, patient unmoved, while the sky above them continues its slow ancient drift. Nothing here asks to be solved. It only asks to be noticed. What endures is not certainty, but continuity. The universe keeps unfolding, the past remains unfinished, and silence still contains more than it reveals. In the vast arithmetic of time, our lives are brief measures, yet our curiosity echoes far beyond us. That is not something to fear. It is something to accept with wonder. Gravity pulls the sand grain by grain. Entropy softens every edge. And still memory survives, sometimes in stories, sometimes in stone, sometimes only in the feeling that something meaningful has passed this way before. Perhaps some truths do not demand answers at all. They ask only for presence. As the night deepens, the desert cools, and the stars continue their watch, the pyramids slip back into stillness. They will remain here long after this moment fades, holding their alignment, their silence, their invitation to look upward and inward at the same time. Rest now, observer. Let the questions settle without urgency. The universe is in no hurry. It will keep its secrets a little longer.